Alright, today we're going to be taking apart a Razer Blade 15-inch gaming laptop. This is the RZ09-0301 series. 7EM2 is the model trim. This has the GeForce RTX 2070 and a 240 Hz 1080p display. And just be advised, we're going to be leaving the display complete, but you will be shown how to remove it. And to start, we're just going to need a small Torx bit. This is a T6. Alright, so we'll start from underneath, and we're going to remove all of these T6 Torx screws. Alright, and once you have those bottom case screws out, you should be able to find a small gap somewhere between the bottom case and the palm rest. And once you do, we'll just gently go around, and just pop it up and off. Once you have like a corner started, the rest of it comes off pretty easy. Alright, take a good look inside. Looks like they left the RAM really easy to get to, so it's definitely an easy upgrade. Same with the SSD, and this is a NVMe 2280 size SSD. Looks like the Wi-Fi card is also pretty easy to get to. And fans look like they're independently replaceable from the heatsink, which is also good. So all in all, it looks like a pretty easy laptop to disassemble and upgrade. And by popular request, we're going to go ahead and see if we can remove the display assembly first. But of course, the first thing we're going to do is disconnect and remove the battery. So we're going to be switching from our T6 Torx to a small Phillips bit. And I'm going to use a, looks like it's kind of a small head here. Usually a 2 or a 2.5 will be good for these. Okay, so I'm going to be using a 2.5 here, and to disconnect the battery, we can just put our fingernail underneath the connector and pry upwards. Switch it around here. Alright, now we can remove these screws. Alright, so we have the battery screws out, and we can go ahead and gently lift it out of the case. Alright, so we can go ahead and flip it around, and it looks like there's a few screws for the hinge covers, and see if we can trace out where the video cable connects. Okay, so the only thing I see coming from the display is the long flat video cable here and the two Wi-Fi antennas. So we'll go ahead and just disconnect those now. And for the Wi-Fi antennas, these just kind of pop up and off. Just pull up on them and they should come off of the Wi-Fi card. And then you'll have to kind of thread them out of the little channels. And so it looks like we got our Wi-Fi antennas loose. Now the connector for the video cable has a little bar. You get your fingernail underneath it and it will swing up, and then you can use that little bar to pull it out of the connector on the motherboard. And then of course we have some tape that needs to be peeled up and off of the heatsink. It looks like they have a smaller cable underneath as well, probably for like the webcam or something, so we'll also remove that. And with that type of connector, it just flips up. And then we'll unstick it from the RAM slot. Okay, so we got the 2 ribbons and the 2 Wi-Fi antennas. And so far that looks like it's the only thing that is coming from the display assembly. So we will go ahead and remove the little hinge covers here. Just a little bit of plastic. Okay, so it looks like the only other thing we need to remove now are the 2 hinge screws on each side. So to do this, we're going to want to open it up all the way. And since this display doesn't open up 180 degrees, you're going to need to support it once you get down to the last 2 hinge screws. So we'll go ahead and just remove 2 of the 4. And then we'll carefully support it from underneath with our other hand and remove those last 2 hinge screws. So the next part can be a little bit tricky and you need to be careful so you don't hurt the ribbon. The display ribbon comes out of the back where the vent is, so you can kind of see it there at the top. So you're just going to kind of need to feed that through a little bit. I'm going to give it a little bit of slack so that I can kind of straighten these out, and just to make it a little bit easier, we're going to pull this tape off. So I definitely recommend doing that. Remove that tape just because it appears that it has to be pulled through that really small channel in the back. And once you get the tape off, we're just going to gently kind of work it through. As long as you don't tug too hard on these ribbons, you should be fine. This way it kind of helps to kind of push and feed it through the little slot as you're pulling, just so you don't put too much pressure on that little ribbon. So this step is definitely going to be easier if the motherboard is removed, but it does look like it's not impossible. So it doesn't look like it's going to be real easy to get that connector through the little port. I've had a lot of requests to remove the display assembly before removing all this other stuff on the motherboard. So it looks like it's possible, but it's not going to be easy, and I don't want to damage the connector by trying to pull it through the palm rest. So we're just going to leave the display kind of off to the side, and then we'll finish it removing it once we get the heatsink disconnected. So in this case, I would call it as you definitely don't want to try to remove the LCD without removing at least the heatsink, and possibly the motherboard as well. We'll be able to tell once we get that heatsink off of there. So just keep in mind, replacing the display assembly is not going to be real easy on this model. So we'll go ahead and just continue on with the palm rest assembly, and we'll start removing the RAM and other stuff that's attached to the motherboard. And as you saw there with the RAM, you just kind of spread those little retainers and the RAM stick will pop up. And for the SSD, one screw, and it'll pop up and you can pull it out of the slot. Same with the Wi-Fi card. Alright, so we'll go ahead and get these fan connectors released. And with this type, it's a real pain. They leave just this tiny little connector without tabs to grip, and you just got to kind of work it from either side. And unfortunately, the wires are so small that you definitely don't want to pull on them. So you got to try to work a tiny little connector out of a smaller connector. So just go back and forth with the small precision tool like a spudger, and you should be able to get that out. But as you see, it's tiny and fragile, so just be patient and work at it. Alright, a couple Phillips screws, and you can remove the fans independent of the heatsink. Alright, so we'll repeat the process on the other side here. I don't usually like using metal bits near the motherboard, but they don't really give you a whole lot of choice with these fan connectors. It's just a really poor design. So you need something that can actually kind of stick into that plastic and pull it out, and the spudger just wasn't doing it. So just be advised that these fan connectors might be kind of a pain to remove. And once you get those screws out, you should be able to remove the fan like the other one. Okay, now that we have the fans removed, we'll go ahead and get rid of all these little sticky pads over the heatsink screws. And then we can remove the heatsink. Alright, so we got the heatsink screws out. In addition to the 8 for the CPU and GPU, there's one on both ends and one right here. So there's a total of 11 screws on that heatsink. And Sometimes the thermal paste can act as a pretty strong adhesive, so starting from the edge, we're just going to kind of wiggle that heatsink back and forth and hopefully unstick it from the board. So just be slow and methodical. No need to kind of force the issue. You just want to slowly and gently work your way around and hopefully get it unstuck from the board. Alright, a little bit more working around and it looks like we have it unstuck. So we're just going to gently lift up on this side and pull it slightly toward the front of the laptop. And then we can see why it was so hard to unstick. There's a ton of thermal pads and thermal paste on the bottom. Okay, so we'll go back to the display assembly, and it gave us a little bit more clearance. It does still feel like it'll be a little bit too hard on the connector to try to pull it through with the motherboard in place. So at least we know that. If you need to replace your screen assembly, be prepared to basically take apart most of the laptop. And we'll go ahead now and just start removing the rest of the connectors on the motherboard. Alright, so some of these, like the speakers, you just pull straight out. Some have a flip-up type retainer. You just flip up on that little piece with your fingernail, pull the ribbon out, and then it's best to flip it back down. Keep it from being broken. So flip up, remove ribbon, flip back down. Same for the smaller one. They sure don't give you a whole lot of slack on some of these ribbons. So you'll probably need a kind of a precision tool to get some of these ribbons out. This is not the easiest motherboard to disconnect. Looks like we have another one over here with a retainer in the back side of the connector. So this style, you flip up on the other side from the ribbon, and that should allow you to remove it. Okay, so it looks like we got all the ribbons now, and we'll just go ahead and remove the screws. It does appear that they've used a couple of really small Phillips bits on the back side of the motherboard, and it appears that these are the only two screws that they chose to use really small screws for. So you're going to need a smaller Phillips bit. I switched to a 1.0 to get the back screws. And then we can switch back to the 2.5. Alright, so we'll give it one last check, make sure we've got all of the screws out. And then with motherboards, you want to pay attention to any ports that might be poking through the palm rest assembly. Make sure you don't pry up against those. And just give it a gentle wiggle at first. And that'll help you make sure that you've got all the screws out. And once you get the board a little bit loose, you're going to have to pull a little bit toward the front of the laptop to clear the pieces from underneath the vent. We'll gently turn it over, make sure there's nothing connected underneath. And now we have our motherboard removed. Okay, so back to the screen. Now you can see the slot, very tiny slot in the back to remove the screen ribbons. It's been requested a lot to, a lot of people want to replace their screens, so I try to do that really early in the game now. But unfortunately with this laptop, it was just a matter of the ribbons and the tiny little slot they give you in the back here to pull the ribbon through. So the screen is not very easily replaceable, so just keep that in mind. If you do need to replace your Razer Blade screen on this model, it's going to be a pretty expensive repair. Alright, so that is it for the display assembly. Okay, so we're left with the speakers. They've got just a couple Phillips screws to replace those. And looks like our power button here is just a one small screw. So we'll go ahead and remove that as well. And looking at the keyboard, I've seen the trend here on most of the newer laptops. If your palm rest assembly is made out of metal, they usually will screw the keyboard in with a ton of tiny screws. But if your palm rest assembly is plastic, more than likely they have just kind of heat melted the keyboard into place, and there's a bunch of melted plastic rivets that hold it in. For the most part, those are non-replaceable, unfortunately. So just a couple screws and we have our power button. And we'll leave that power button cover. So it looks like in this case, you got dozens of these tiny little Phillips screws, but the keyboard is definitely replaceable independent of the palm rest. Whereas mostly if you have a plastic palm rest, you're going to have to replace everything as an assembly. And touchpad as well looks like it's pretty easily removable, just a few small Phillips screws. So that is it. That is how you disassemble the Razer Blade 15-inch gaming laptop. This is the RZ09-0301 series, 7EM2. This had the RTX 2070 video card and the 240 Hz display. So if this video helped you or you found it informative, please like and subscribe. Thank you.